Hi folks, this is International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today we'll be doing a lesson on the topic of active defense. Now, you've probably heard in chess or even other sports the following phrase that a best defense is a good offense, or a best defense is counterattack. This really reigns true in chess, and hopefully the examples that I'll be showing you today will be really instructive for you guys to see how strong players can defend bad positions. So my first example here is I wanted to talk about how some openings actually force you to play very actively if you want to get a decent position. King's Indian is one example of such openings. Other examples would be, for example, various Sicilians or the Grunfeld. Basically any opening, the Benoni, any opening where you're forced to play actively just to hold the position or keep the position level is an opening where you will have to play aggressively and fight for counterplay if you want to get a decent position. So I wanted to start with the point that some openings are especially important for you to understand that this idea of active defense is just very important. Here, White has played the Samish variation of the King's Indian, indicated by the move f3. And White's idea is actually to play kind of like a Yugoslav attack with the moves bishop e3, queen d2, and in a lot of cases, White will castle queenside here and go for the attack. So Black has many ways of responding to this. In this game, the Chinese Grandmaster chose one of the more common paths with castles in e5. Knight ge2 was played, c6, queen d2, knight bd7, long castles, and a6. So this is all quite normal. And as you notice, the kings are now castled on opposite sides of the board, and that means that both sides have a very natural plan of pushing their pawns against the enemy king and trying to open files as quickly as possible. So for White, we can easily imagine throwing the pawn down h4 and h5 would be really strong. And for Black, Black is going to try and push b5 and try to open lines on the queen side. So it's very important that Black plays this position as actively as possible, because long term it's just not possible for Black to prevent White's kingside attack from succeeding. Given enough moves, White will build a very strong attack on the kingside, until Black's only chance in this kind of position is to get enough counterplay on the queenside to kind of hold the balance. So here White played bishop h6, and this is all fairly well known still. Black takes, queen takes, b5, h4, and queen a5. And this is actually still following theory. There's one or two Kasparov games here from this position. And if both sides play accurately, actually the game should lead to a draw by repetition. White's best move here is h5, and White is ready to open the h file and get a very strong attack. Knight takes h5 would run into the move g4, where White is able to open the h file with pretty much decisive effect. For example, Black has to go back to f6, and here White can play knight g3, for example, or can also push g5, knight h5, and simply sacrifice the exchange, with the idea to play knight g3, and now this knight is coming to f5 or h5, and queen to g7 is a very serious mating threat. So White is already just winning in this position. So after h5, Black has to leave the pawn on h5 alone, and Black's only chance here is again to just keep pushing on the queen side. So b4 is the main move here. Knight b1, queen takes a2, knight g3, and knight b6. This move kind of combines attack with defense. The knight on b6 can come to either c4 or a4, and it opens up the bishop on c8 to potentially control the f5 square if needed. And now we won't go too much further than this, but the theory actually continues. White plays c5 and knight c4, and even the move rook d2 here is quite strong for White. And the point is, if Black takes the exchange, he ends up being not able to create enough counterplay on the queen side to equalize the game. And in fact, White's attack becomes very successful. So you can see how far deep the theory goes here and how difficult it is to play these positions. But if you have in mind the idea that you do need to play very actively, then this could be the right opening for you because you're going to be able to demonstrate, some of your tactical ability and your attacking ability by playing this kind of opening. So I wanted to start with this example just to show you that in some cases you have to play active defense right from the very start. It's not enough to simply play passively, get a bad position, and then try to figure out a way out. By the way, the best move here for black is not knight takes d2 as I mentioned, but actually to play knight a5 with the idea of playing knight b3 check. King would have to go to c2 and then knight a1 check. And this is how a few games have finished with this nice little perpetual check. For example, c takes d6, knight b3, and both sides repeat. The king can't move anywhere else because the knight on b1 will simply hang with check. And we have a draw by repetition. Okay, so now we'll move on to our next example, and I have a few examples for you guys today to show you some common ways where active defense is very, very important. So in this next game here, playing black is a legendary player, Grandmaster Kavutskiy, who was candidate for the World Championship both in the 90s and in more recent years as well. And black has kind of a somewhat passive position because white has this advanced pawn on e5, which is restricting the bishop on g7, restricting the knight on d7, and obviously black's bishop on c8 is quite a problem piece here. White has sacrificed one pawn in order to get this position, but white is ready to play knight takes c4 and have a pretty much dominating game. This knight can come to d6, and the other knight can come to e4, for example. So here Kavutskiy played what's basically the only good move for black. And if you're familiar with this kind of structure, as you already probably have an idea of what that move is. If not, you can pause the video and try to think for yourself what you would play here for black in order to kind of free your position. And in fact, the best move here for black is to play c5. It's very important, especially when you're fighting against a space advantage, to play this move c5 in order to fight against the center and try to activate some of the pieces here. Passive defense just won't do in this position. So white played knight takes c4, c takes d4, queen takes d4. And now black has a nice tactic with knight takes e5 in order to, again, win an extra pawn. The point is that the queen on d4 is hanging, so white cannot take on e5. And after queen takes d8, rook takes d8, the knight on e5 is protected and black is up a pawn. But things are not so simple, and the game continued in a very interesting way. White played knight b6, rook b8, and rook fd1. So white is going to get quite a bit of compensation for the pawn in view of the fact that it's not easy here for black to develop. And it's hard for black here to connect the rooks. So bishop f6 was played, defending the rook on d8. Knight e4, bishop e7, and b4. Black played king f8. If, for example, black played rook takes d1, white takes back, and bishop takes b4, this will lose a piece to rook d8 check, followed by rook takes c8. So after b4, black played king f8. Now white trades rooks, and trades on c8, and played knight d6. And playing white here was a 2600 level grandmaster, so quite a strong player. And after the move knight d6, white is winning the pawn back because his bishop on g2 has been opened up against this b7 pawn, and once the bishop takes on b7, the a6 pawn will also be hanging. If white is able to take these two pawns, then his two connected passers, b4 and a5, will be very, very strong. So black here definitely has some issues because if white gets these connected passers, these will be very, very powerful in the endgame, especially when supported by the knight and the light-scored bishop. So Kavutskiy here plays this part of the game quite perfectly. He starts with the move rook c2, and white takes on b7, and bishop e7. So he's attacking the knight, and behind the knight is the b4 pawn. White played rook d1, and rook b2. So black is able to get rid of one of white's pawns on the queen side. A move like rook d4, for example, would not be good since black can take the knight on d6 and then win the pawn on b4. So bishop takes a6 was played, rook takes b4, bishop f1, black puts the rook behind the passed pawn, of course, and a6. So kind of a interesting endgame. White has a fairly strong passed pawn on a6, supported nicely by the bishop on f1, but fortunately for black, he has his rook behind the passed pawn, which is the best place for the rook, because now the rook can not only defend against the pawn advancing, but can also contribute to the game by, for example, going to the second rank and trying to target white's king. So again, black is still the one defending here, and it's very important that black tries to find some kind of counterplay. A lot of players would be inclined to kind of sit on the position and try to build some kind of fortress with the rook on the a-file. But long term, this is not such a good strategy because perhaps white can slowly maneuver, move his knight around to c8 or something, and slowly try to push the pawn forward. So black's best chance in this position is to fight for some kind of counterplay. And black starts with the move g4. Very nice move to fix white's pawns and allow for knight f3 check in many cases. Bishop e2 was played, h5, white played king f1, and now h4. So now white made a mistake with the move g takes h4. It was clear that he was concerned about black playing h3 and pushing this pawn to a very strong position on h3. But what white should have done is try and support his a-pawn so that black cannot get his rook away from the a-file. So the best move here was knight c8, and with best play, this should be a pretty balanced position and should eventually lead to a draw. For example, h3, knight b6, rook a2. And black here has a lot of counterplay on the second rank, and it's not easy for white to push the a-pawn. So white should actually force a repetition with the move rook d4. And the idea is that now white is threatening rook a4 or knight a4, which would block black's rook. So black basically has to give check on a1. White goes back, and after rook a2, the two sides should repeat moves rook d4, as neither side has anything better. But instead, white took the pawn on h4, black played bishop takes h4, knight c8. And here the difference is that black has this move rook f4. This was really excellently calculated by Kavutskiy, and in fact now black has an advantage. So white pushed a7, and rook takes f2 check. So if king g1, black is in time to simply take on e2, and when white queens, knight f3 check is going to lead to mate. King h1 is rook takes h2, or king f1, rook f2 mate. So white would be forced to give back the queen on f3, and after black recaptures, well, he's up 2 pawns, and the bishop, pawn, and rook are very, very active here. So this would be completely winning for black. So after rook takes f2 check, white played king e1, and now comes black's second idea here, knight f3 check. Bishop takes f3, and he doesn't recapture, but first he takes the pawn on h2 with check, king f1, and g takes f3. Now white still cannot queen because rook h1 is going to be checkmate. So like I said, this was really very well calculated by black, very, very accurate. King g1 had to be played to avoid mate, and after rook a2, black is able to get his rook behind the pawn again, and now black is up 2 pawns and is winning the game because white just doesn't have a way to support the a-pawn. Rook f1 was played, bishop e7, rook takes f3, bishop c5 check, and black is picking up the pawn. King h1 takes, knight d6, and after rook f2, white had to resign since he is down 2 pawns and is in a hopeless endgame. So a really nice example by Kavutskiy about the power of active defense. Not only was he able to hold the balance in this endgame that was pretty difficult, but he was even able to seize the initiative and eventually win the game. So when you're playing an endgame and you feel like you're worse or you're behind, you really need to look for those active opportunities. Our final example today It just shows a very, very interesting concept. This game came from the 2012 Olympiad in Istanbul between two very strong players. Playing white is Grandmaster Sergei Movsesian of Armenia, close to 2700, and now I believe he is well over 2700 in rating. And his opponent is the Chinese Grandmaster Wang Yu, who's also a very strong 2700 level player. So here white, who has kind of a space advantage with the knight on e5, pawn on c5. Here white plays the move f5. So he's really going for the attack and he's trying to open the f-file. And now black's decision here was really, really amazing. He starts with bishop takes e5. And already this is not an obvious move, I think, because many players would be hesitant to give up their fianchetto bishop. But it is quite a close position, which means that the knight on e5 is at least equal to a bishop, if not stronger. So bishop takes e5 definitely makes sense from a positional or strategic point of view. And here black played g takes f5, rook takes f5, and it seems like what black has done is absolutely crazy. He's given up the dark squared bishop, he's taken on f5, which weakens his whole structure, but we'll see his idea is actually quite ingenious. So he plays knight d7, and white simply captures the pawn on h5. And now it seems like black is really busted because now he's down a pawn and white has huge pressure on f7. And here comes a very, very shocking move, e6. So black is voluntarily breaking the connection with the bishop to f7, so this pawn is now available for capture, and we'll see the idea in just a moment. So white cannot take the pawn with the rook because of rook takes h5, and white doesn't have any follow-up, is just down a piece. But what happens after bishop takes f7, as was played in the game? Well, king e7. Now the rook on f5 is under attack, so white went back, rook f1, and queen c7. And as you start to look at the position, you notice kind of the elements of what black is trying to do here. He wants to win the pawn on e5 with the knight, and then he's actually going to use the open h-file and the queen on c7 to create a very vicious counterattack against the h2 pawn. And his rook on a8 is also able to join the action on the f8 square. So what black has done, he's temporarily sacrificed a couple of pawns in order to get his pieces into the game actually and create this huge, huge counterattack against white's position. And if you notice, the rest of white's pieces are actually quite bad here. The bishop on c1 is quite an awful piece, and in effect, it's also blocking the rook on a1. Now, if white had time to transfer the bishop to g3, white would have a completely dominating position, but he's simply well short on time. So I really loved this concept, and black won the game very easily. Bishop g6 was played, knight takes e5, bishop takes e4, and now it's a matter of good calculation here. Knight d3 was played, white is forced to take the knight, queen takes h2 check, and now it is white's king that ends up in huge, huge trouble. King e2, queen g3. Now black's other rook is coming to h1, with simply decisive effect since white is very, very weak on the back rank. King e2, rook h1, bishop d2. At this point, white really doesn't have a choice because the threat of queen e1 checkmate is too strong, and white is also under pressure here on e4. So white played bishop d2, gave back the exchange, and black had a completely winning position. In fact, the game did not last much longer because white's king ended up being very, very weak, and after queen f5 check, white had to resign as he's getting mated. King d4 is queen e4 mate, or king e2 is queen f1 mate. So I really, really thought this was quite an amazing game because black's decision here after f5 to trade on e5 and take on f5 is not something that would be obvious to even very, very strong players. But this idea of creating this counterplay along the h-file was simply brilliant in my view. So I hope you guys enjoyed the lesson today. Hopefully I've illustrated the importance of active defense quite well. And until next time, this has been International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, signing off.